Section 7 of When God Laughs by Jack London. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Section 7. Make Westing. Whatever you do, make westing, make westing. Sailing directions for Cape Horn. For 7 weeks the Mary Rogers had been between 50 degrees south in the Atlantic and 50 degrees south in the Pacific, which meant that for 7 weeks she had been struggling to round Cape Horn. For 7 weeks she had been either in dirt or close to dirt, save once, and then following upon 6 days of excessive dirt, which she had ridden out under the shelter of the redoubtable Tierra del Fuego coast, she had almost gone ashore during a heavy swell in the dead calm that had suddenly fallen. For 7 weeks she had wrestled with the Cape Horn graybeards, and in return been buffeted and smashed by them. She was a wooden ship, and her ceaseless straining had opened her seams, so that twice a day the watch took its turn at the pumps. The Mary Rogers was strained, the crew was strained, and Big Dan Cullen, master, was likewise strained. Perhaps he was strained most of all, for upon him rested the responsibility of that titanic struggle. He slept most of the time in his clothes, although he rarely slept. He haunted the deck at night, a great, burly, robust ghost, black with the sunburn of 30 years of sea and hairy as an orangutan. He, in turn, was haunted by one thought of action, a sailing direction for the Horn. Whatever you do, make westing, make westing. It was an obsession. He thought of nothing else, except at times to blaspheme God for sending such bitter weather. Make westing. He hugged the Horn, and a dozen times lay hove to with the iron cape bearing east by north or north-northeast, a score of miles away, and each time the eternal west wind smote him back and he made easting. He fought gale after gale, south to 64 degrees, inside the Antarctic drift ice, and pledged his immortal soul to the powers of darkness for a bit of westing, for a slant to take him around. And he made easting. In despair, he had tried to make the passage through the Straits of Le Maire. Halfway through, the wind hauled to the northward of northeast, the glass dropped to 28.88, and he turned and ran before a gale of cyclonic fury, missing by a hair's breadth, piling up the Mary Rogers on the black-toothed rocks. Twice he had made west to the Diego Ramirez rocks, one of the times saved between 2 snow squalls by sighting the gravestones of ships a quarter of a mile dead ahead. Blow! Captain Dan Cullen instanced all his 30 years at sea to prove that never had it blown so before. The Mary Rogers was hove to at the time he gave the evidence, and, to clinch it, inside half an hour the Mary Rogers was hove down to the hatches. Her new maintopsail and brand new spencer were blown away like tissue paper, and 5 sails, furled and fast under double gaskets, were blown loose and stripped from the yards. And before morning the Mary Rogers was hove down twice again, and holes were knocked in her bulwarks to ease her decks from the weight of ocean that pressed her down. On an average of once a week, Captain Dan Cullen caught glimpses of the sun. Once, for 10 minutes, the sun shone at midday, and 10 minutes afterward a new gale was piping up. Both watches were shortening sail, and all was buried in the obscurity of a driving snow squall. For a fortnight, once, Captain Dan Cullen was without a meridian or a chronometer sight. Rarely did he know his position within half of a degree, except when in sight of land, for sun and stars remained hidden behind the sky, and it was so gloomy that even at the best the horizons were poor for accurate observations. A gray gloom shrouded the world. The clouds were gray, the great driving seas were leaden gray, the smoking crests were a gray churning. Even the occasional albatrosses were gray, while the snow flurries were not white, but gray, under the somber pall of the heavens. Life on board the Mary Rogers was gray, gray and gloomy. The faces of the sailors were blue-gray. They were afflicted with sea cuts and sea boils, and suffered exquisitely. They were shadows of men. For 7 weeks, in the forecastle or on deck, they had not known what it was to be dry. They had forgotten what it was to sleep out a watch, and all watches it was "all hands on deck." They caught snatches of agonized sleep, and they slept in their oilskins, ready for the everlasting call. So weak and worn were they that it took both watches to do the work of one. That was why both watches were on deck so much of the time. And no shadow of a man could shirk duty. Nothing less than a broken leg could enable a man to knock off work. And there were two such who had been mauled and pulped by the seas that broke aboard. One other man who was the shadow of a man was George Dougherty. He was the only passenger on board, a friend of the firm, and he had elected to make the voyage for his health. But 7 weeks of Cape Horn had not bettered his health. He gasped and panted in his bunk through the long, heaving nights, and when on deck he was so bundled up for warmth that he resembled a peripatetic old clothes shop. At midday, eating at the cabin table in a gloom so deep that the swinging sea lamps burned always, he looked as blue-gray as the sickest, saddest man for'ard. Nor did gazing across the table at Captain Dan Cullen have any cheering effect upon him. Captain Cullen chewed and scowled and kept silent. The scowls were for God, and with every chew he reiterated the sole thought of his existence, which was make westing. He was a big, hairy brute, and the sight of him was not stimulating to the other's appetite. He looked upon George Dougherty as a Jonah, and told him so, once each meal, savagely transferring the scowl from God to the passenger and back again. Nor did the mate prove a first aid to a languid appetite. Joshua Higgins by name, a seaman by profession and pull, but a pot-walloper by capacity, he was a loose-jointed, sniffling creature, heartless and selfish and cowardly, without a soul, in fear of his life of Dan Cullen, and a bully over the sailors, who knew that behind the mate was Captain Cullen, the lawgiver and compeller, the driver and the destroyer, the incarnation of a dozen bucko mates. In that wild weather at the southern end of the earth, Joshua Higgins ceased washing. His grimy face usually robbed George Dougherty of what little appetite he managed to accumulate. Ordinarily, this lavatorial dereliction would have caught Captain Cullen's eye and vocabulary, but in the present his mind was filled with making westing, to the exclusion of all other things not contributory thereto. Whether the mate's face was clean or dirty had no bearing upon westing. Later on, when 50 degrees south in the Pacific had been reached, Joshua Higgins would wash his face very abruptly. In the meantime, at the cabin table, where gray twilight alternated with lamplight while the lamps were being filled, George Dougherty sat between the two men, one a tiger and the other a hyena, and wondered why God had made them. The second mate, Matthew Turner, was a true sailor and a man, but George Dougherty did not have the solace of his company, for he ate by himself, solitary, when they had finished. On Saturday morning, July 24, George Dougherty awoke to a feeling of life and headlong movement. On deck he found the Mary Rogers running off before a howling southeaster. Nothing was set but the lower topsails and the foresail. It was all she could stand, yet she was making 14 knots, as Mr. Turner shouted in Dougherty's ear when he came on deck. And it was all westing. She was going round the Horn at last, if the wind held. Mr. Turner looked happy. The end of the struggle was in sight, but Captain Cullen did not want God to know that he was pleased with that wind. He had a conception of a malicious God, and believed in his secret soul that if God knew it was a desirable wind, God would promptly efface it and send a snorter from the west. So he walked softly before God, smothering his joy down under scowls and muttered curses, and so fooling God, for God was the only thing in the universe of which Dan Cullen was afraid. All Saturday and Saturday night the Mary Rogers raced her westing. Persistently she logged her 14 knots, so that by Sunday morning she had covered 350 miles. If the wind held, she would make around. If it failed, and the snorter came from anywhere between southwest and north, back the Mary Rogers would be hurled, and be no better off than she had been 7 weeks before. And on Sunday morning the wind was failing. The big sea was going down and running smooth. Both watches were on deck, setting sail after sail as fast as the ship could stand it. And now Captain Cullen went around brazenly before God, smoking a big cigar, smiling jubilantly as if the failing wind delighted him, while down underneath he was raging against God for taking the life out of the blessed wind. Make westing! So he would, if God would only leave him alone. Secretly he pledged himself anew to the powers of darkness, if they would let him make westing. He pledged himself so easily because he did not believe in the powers of darkness. He really believed only in God, though he did not know it. And in his inverted theology, God was really the Prince of Darkness. Captain Cullen was a devil worshipper, but he called the devil by another name. That was all. At midday, after calling 8 bells, Captain Cullen ordered the royals on. The men went aloft faster than they had gone in weeks. Not alone were they nimble because of the westing, but a benignant sun was shining down and limbering their stiff bodies. George Dougherty stood aft, near Captain Cullen, less bundled in clothes than usual, soaking in the grateful warmth as he watched the scene. Swiftly and abruptly the incident occurred. There was a cry from the foreroyal yard of "Man overboard!" Somebody threw a life buoy over the side, and at the same instant the second mate's voice came aft, ringing and peremptory. "Hard down your helm!" The man at the wheel never moved a spoke. He knew better, for Captain Dan Cullen was standing alongside of him. He wanted to move a spoke, to move all the spokes, to grind the wheel down, hard down for his comrade drowning in the sea. He glanced at Captain Dan Cullen, and Captain Dan Cullen gave no sign. "Down! Hard down!" the second mate roared as he sprang aft. But he ceased springing and commanding, and stood still when he saw Dan Cullen by the wheel. And big Dan Cullen puffed at his cigar and said nothing. Astern, and going astern fast, could be seen the sailor. He had caught the life buoy and was clinging to it. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The men aloft clung to the royal yards and watched with terror-stricken faces. And the Mary Rogers raced on, making her westing. A long, silent minute passed. "Who was it?" Captain Cullen demanded. "Mops, sir," eagerly answered the sailor at the wheel. Mops topped a wave astern and disappeared temporarily in the trough. It was a large wave, but it was no Graybeard. A small boat could live easily in such a sea, and in such a sea the Mary Rogers could easily come to, but she could not come to and make westing at the same time. For the first time in all his years, George Dougherty was seeing a real drama of life and death, a sordid little drama in which the scales balanced an unknown sailor named Mops against a few miles of longitude. At first he had watched the man astern, but now he watched big Dan Cullen, hairy and black, vested with power of life and death, smoking a cigar. Captain Dan Cullen smoked another long, silent minute. Then he removed the cigar from his mouth. He glanced aloft at the spars of the Mary Rogers and overside at the sea. "Sheet home the royals!" he cried. 15 minutes later they sat at table in the cabin with food served before them. On one side of George Dougherty sat Dan Cullen, the tiger. On the other side, Joshua Higgins, the hyena. Nobody spoke. On deck the men were sheeting home the skysails. George Dougherty could hear their cries, while a persistent vision haunted him of a man called Mops, alive and well, clinging to a life buoy, miles astern in that lonely ocean. He glanced at Captain Cullen and experienced a feeling of nausea, for the man was eating his food with relish, almost bolting it. "Captain Cullen," Dougherty said, "you are in command of this ship, and it is not proper for me to comment now upon what you do. But I wish to say one thing. There is a hereafter, and yours will be a hot one." Captain Cullen did not even scowl. In his voice was regret as he said, "It was blowing a living gale. It was impossible to save the man." "He fell from the royal yard," Dougherty cried hotly. "You were setting the royals at the time. 15 minutes afterward you were setting the skysails." "It was a living gale, wasn't it, Mr. Higgins?" Captain Cullen said, turning to the mate. "If you'd brought her to, it'd have taken the sticks out of her," was the mate's answer. "You did the proper thing, Captain Cullen. The man hadn't a ghost of a show." George Dougherty made no answer, and to the meal's end no one spoke. After that, Dougherty had his meals served in his stateroom. Captain Cullen scowled at him no longer, though no speech was exchanged between them, while the Mary Rogers sped north toward warmer latitudes. At the end of the week, Dan Cullen cornered Dougherty on deck. "What are you going to do when we get to 'Frisco?" he demanded bluntly. "I am going to swear out a warrant for your arrest," Dougherty answered quietly. "I am going to charge you with murder, and I am going to see you hanged for it." "You're almighty sure of yourself," Captain Cullen sneered, turning on his heel. A second week passed, and one morning found George Dougherty standing in the coach house companionway at the forward end of the long poop, taking his first gaze around the deck. The Mary Rogers was reaching full and by in a stiff breeze. Every sail was set and drawing, including the staysails. Captain Cullen strolled forward along the poop. He strolled carelessly, glancing at the passenger out of the corner of his eye. Dougherty was looking the other way, standing with head and shoulders outside the companionway, and only the back of his head was to be seen. Captain Cullen, with swift eye, embraced the mainstaysail block and the head, and estimated the distance. He glanced about him. Nobody was looking. Aft, Joshua Higgins, pacing up and down, had just turned his back and was going the other way. Captain Cullen bent over suddenly and cast the staysail sheet off from its pin. The heavy block hurtled through the air, smashing Dougherty's head like an eggshell and hurtling on back and forth as the staysail whipped and slatted in the wind. Joshua Higgins turned around to see what had carried away, and met the full blast of the vilest portion of Captain Cullen's profanity. "I made the sheet fast myself," whimpered the mate in first lull, "with an extra turn to make sure. I remember it distinctly." "Made fast?" the captain snarled back, for the benefit of the watch as it struggled to capture the flying sail before it tore to ribbons. "You couldn't make your grandmother fast, you useless hell's scullion. If you made that sheet fast with an extra turn, why in hell didn't it stay fast? That's what I want to know. Why in hell didn't it stay fast?" The mate whined inarticulately. "Oh, shut up," was the final word of Captain Cullen. Half an hour later, he was surprised as any when the body of George Dougherty was found inside the companionway on the floor. In the afternoon, alone in his room, he doctored up the log. "Ordinary seaman Carl Brunn," he wrote. "Lost overboard from fore royal yard in a gale of wind. Was running at the time, and for the safety of the ship did not dare come up to the wind. Nor could a boat have lived in the sea that was running." On another page he wrote: "Had often warned Mr. Dougherty about the danger he ran because of his carelessness on deck. I told him once that some day he would get his head knocked off by a block. A carelessly fastened mainstaysail sheet was the cause of the accident, which was deeply to be regretted because Mr. Dougherty was a favorite with all of us." Captain Dan Cullen read over his literary effort with admiration, blotted the page, and closed the log. He lighted a cigar and stared before him. He felt the Mary Rogers lift and heel and surge along, and knew that she was making 9 knots. A smile of satisfaction slowly dawned on his black and hairy face. Well, anyway, he had made his westing and fooled God. End of Section 7, read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com. Section 8 of When God Laughs by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Section 8. Semper Edem. Dr. Bicknell was in a remarkably gracious mood. Through a minor accident, a slight bit of carelessness, that was all, a man who might have pulled through had died the preceding night. Though it had been only a sailor man, one of the innumerable unwashed, the steward of the receiving hospital had been on the anxious seat all the morning. It was not that the man had died that gave him discomfort. He knew the doctor too well for that, but his distress lay in the fact that the operation had been done so well. One of the most delicate in surgery, it had been as successful as it was clever and audacious. All had then depended upon the treatment, the nurses, the steward, and the man had died. Nothing much, a bit of carelessness. yet enough to bring the professional wrath of Dr. Bicknell about his ears and to perturb the working of the staff and nurses for 24 hours to come. But, as already stated, the doctor was in a remarkably gracious mood. When informed by the steward, in fear and trembling, of the man's unexpected take off, his lips did not so much as form one syllable of censure. Nay, they were so pursed that snatches of ragtime floated softly from them, to be broken only by a pleasant query after the health of the other's eldest born. The steward, deeming it impossible that he could have caught the gist of the case, repeated it. "Yes, yes," Dr. Bicknell said impatiently. "I understand. But how about Semper Edem? Is he ready to leave?" "Yes, they're helping him dress now," the steward answered, passing on to the round of his duties, content that peace still reigned within the iodine-saturated walls. It was Semper Edem's recovery that had so fully compensated Dr. Bicknell for the loss of the sailorman. Lives were to him as nothing, the unpleasant but inevitable incidents of the profession. But cases, cases were everything. People who knew him were prone to brand him a butcher, but his colleagues were at one in the belief that a bolder and yet a more capable man never stood over the table. He was not an imaginative man. He did not possess, and hence had no tolerance for, emotion. His nature was accurate, precise, scientific. Men were to him no more than pawns, without individuality or personal value. But as cases it was different. The more broken a man was, the more precarious his grip on life, the greater his significance in the eyes of Dr. Bicknell. He could as readily forsake a poet laureate suffering from a common accident for a nameless mangled vagrant who defied every law of life by refusing to die, as would a child forsake a Punch and Judy for a circus. So it had been in the case of Semper Edem. The mystery of the man had not appealed to him, nor had his silence and the veiled romance the yellow reporters had so sensationally and so fruitlessly exploited in divers Sunday editions. But Semper Edem's throat had been cut. That was the point. That was where his interest had centered. Cut from ear to ear, and not one surgeon in 1,000 to give a snap of the fingers for his chance of recovery. But, thanks to the swift municipal ambulance service and to Dr. Bicknell, he had been dragged back into the world he had sought to leave. The doctor's co-workers had shaken their heads when the case was brought in. Impossible, they said. Throat, windpipe, jugular, all but actually severed, and the loss of blood frightful. As it was such a foregone conclusion, Dr. Bicknell had employed methods and done things which made them, even in their professional capacities, shudder. And lo, the man had recovered. So, on this morning that Semper Edem was to leave the hospital, hale and hearty, Dr. Bicknell's geniality was in no wise disturbed by the steward's report, and he proceeded cheerfully to bring order out of the chaos of a child's body which had been ground and crunched beneath the wheels of an electric car. As many will remember, the case of Semper Edem aroused a vast deal of unseemly yet highly natural curiosity. He had been found in a slum lodging, with throat cut as aforementioned, and blood dripping down upon the inmates of the room below and disturbing their festivities. He had evidently done the deed standing, with head bowed forward that he might gaze his last upon a photograph which stood on the table propped against a candlestick. It was this attitude which had made it possible for Dr. Bicknell to save him. So terrific had been the sweep of the razor that had he had his head thrown back, as he should have done to have accomplished the act properly, with his neck stretched and the elastic vascular walls distended, he would have of a certainty well nigh decapitated himself. At the hospital, during all the time he travelled the repugnant road back to life, not a word had left his lips. Nor could anything be learned of him by the sleuths detailed by the chief of police. Nobody knew him, nor had ever seen or heard of him before. He was strictly, uniquely of the present. His clothes and surroundings were those of the lowest labourer, his hands the hands of a gentleman. But not a shred of writing was discovered, nothing save one particular which would serve to indicate his past or his position in life. And that one particular was the photograph. If it were at all a likeness, the woman who gazed frankly out upon the onlooker from the card mount must have been a striking creature indeed. It was an amateur production, for the detectives were baffled in that no professional photographer's signature or studio was appended. Across a corner of the mount, in delicate feminine tracery, was written "Semper Edem, Semper Fidelis," and she looked it. As many recollect, it was a face one could never forget. Clever half-tones, remarkably like, were published in all the leading papers at the time, but such procedure gave rise to nothing but the uncontrollable public curiosity and interminable copy to the space writers. For want of a better name, the rescued suicide was known to the hospital attendants and to the world as Semper Edem, and Semper Edem he remained. Reporters, detectives, and nurses gave him up in despair. Not one word could he be persuaded to utter, yet the flitting conscious light of his eyes showed that his ears heard and his brain grasped every question put to him. But this mystery and romance played no part in Dr. Bicknell's interest when he paused in the office to have a parting word with his patient. He, the doctor, had performed a prodigy in the matter of this man, done what was virtually unprecedented in the annals of surgery. He did not care who or what the man was, and it was highly improbable that he should ever see him again. But, like the artist gazing upon a finished creation, he wished to look for the last time upon the work of his hand and brain. Semper Edem still remained mute. He seemed anxious to be gone. Not a word could the doctor extract from him, and little the doctor cared. He examined the throat of the convalescent carefully, idling over the hideous scar with the lingering, half-caressing fondness of a parent. It was not a particularly pleasing sight. An angry line circled the throat, for all the world as though the man had just escaped the hangman's noose, and, disappearing below the ear on either side, had the appearance of completing the fiery periphery at the nape of the neck. Maintaining his dogged silence, yielding to the other's examination in much the manner of a leashed lion, Semper Edem betrayed only his desire to drop from out of the public eye. "Well, I'll not keep you," Dr. Bicknell finally said, laying a hand on the man's shoulder and stealing a last glance at his own handiwork. "But let me give you a bit of advice. Next time you try it on, hold your chin up, so. Don't snuggle it down and butcher yourself like a cow. Neatness and dispatch, you know. Neatness and dispatch." Semper Edem's eyes flashed in token that he heard, and a moment later the hospital door swung to on his heel. It was a busy day for Dr. Bicknell, and the afternoon was well along when he lighted a cigar preparatory to leaving the table upon which it seemed the sufferers almost clamored to be laid. The last one, an old rag picker with a broken shoulder blade, had been disposed of, and the first fragrant smoke wreaths had begun to curl about his head, when the gong of a hurrying ambulance came through the open window from the street, followed by the inevitable entry of the stretcher with its ghastly freight. "Lay it on the table," the doctor directed, turning for a moment to place his cigar in safety. "What is it?" "Suicide. Throat cut," responded one of the stretcher bearers. "Down on Morgan Alley. Little hope, I think, sir. He's most gone." Well, I'll give him a look anyway." He leaned over the man at the moment when the quick made its last faint flutter and succumbed. "It's Semper Edem, come back again," the steward said. "Aye," replied Dr. Bicknell, "and gone again. No bungling this time. Properly done, upon my life, sir, properly done. Took my advice to the letter. I'm not required here. Take it along to the morgue." Dr. Bicknell secured his cigar and relighted it. "That," he said between the puffs, looking at the steward, "that evens up for the one you lost last night. We're quits now." End of Section 8, read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com. Section 9 of When God Laughs by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Section 9. A Nose for the King. In the morning calm of Korea, when its peace and tranquility truly merited its ancient name, Cho Sen, there had been a politician by name Yi Chin Ho. He was a man of parts, and, who shall say, perhaps in no wise worse than politicians the world over. But unlike his brethren in other lands, Yi Chin Ho was in jail. Not that he had inadvertently diverted to himself public moneys, but that he had inadvertently diverted too much. Excess is to be deplored in all things, even in grafting, and Yi Chin Ho's excess had brought him to most deplorable straits. 10,000 strings of cash he owed the government, and he lay in prison under sentence of death. There was one advantage to the situation. He had plenty of time in which to think. And he thought well. Then called he the jailer to him.
"Most worthy man, you see before you one most wretched," he began. "Yet all will be well with me if you will but let me go free for one short hour this night. And all will be well with you, for I shall see to your advancement through the years, and you shall come at length to the directorship of all the prisons of Cho Sen."
"How now?" demanded the jailer. "What foolishness is this? One short hour, and you but waiting for your head to be chopped off, and I with an aged and much to be respected mother, not to say anything of a wife and several children of tender years? Out upon you for the scoundrel that you are!"
"From the sacred city to the ends of all the 8 coasts there is no place for me to hide," Yi Chin Ho made reply. "I am a man of wisdom, but of what worth my wisdom here in prison? Were I free, well I know I could seek out and obtain the money wherewith to repay the government. I know of a nose that will save me from all my difficulties."
"A nose?" cried the jailer.
"A nose," said Yi Chin Ho. "A remarkable nose, if I may say so. A most remarkable nose."
The jailer threw up his hands despairingly. "Ah, what a wag you are! What a wag!" he laughed. "To think that that very admirable wit of yours must go the way of the chopping block." And so saying, he turned and went away. But in the end, being a man soft of head and heart, when the night was well along, he permitted Yi Chin Ho to go. Straight he went to the Governor, catching him alone and arousing him from his sleep. "Yi Chin Ho, or I'm no Governor!" cried the Governor. "What do you here, who should be in prison waiting on the chopping block?"
"I pray your Excellency listen to me," said Yi Chin Ho, squatting on his hams by the bedside and lighting his pipe from the firebox. "A dead man is without value. It is true, I am as a dead man, without value to the government, to your Excellency, or to myself. But if, so to say, your Excellency were to give me my freedom."
"Impossible!" cried the Governor. "Beside, you are condemned to death."
"Your Excellency well knows that if I can repay the 10,000 strings of cash, the government will pardon me."
Yi Chin Ho went on.
"So, as I say, if your Excellency were to give me my freedom for a few days, being a man of understanding, I should then repay the government and be in position to be of service to your Excellency. I should be in position to be of very great service to your Excellency."
"Have you a plan whereby you hope to obtain this money?" asked the Governor.
"I have," said Yi Chin Ho.
"Then come with it to me to morrow night. I would now sleep," said the Governor, taking up his snore where it had been interrupted. On the following night, having again obtained leave of absence from the jailer, Yi Chin Ho presented himself at the Governor's bedside. "Is it you, Yi Chin Ho?" asked the Governor. "And have you the plan?"
"It is I, your Excellency," answered Yi Chin Ho, "and the plan is here."
"Speak," commanded the Governor.
"The plan is here," repeated Yi Chin Ho, "here in my hand."
The Governor sat up and opened his eyes. Yi Chin Ho proffered in his hand a sheet of paper. The Governor held it to the light. "Nothing but a nose," said he.
"A bit pinched, so and so, your Excellency," said Yi Chin Ho.
"Yes, a bit pinched here and there, as you say," said the Governor.
"Withal it is an exceeding corpulent nose, thus and so, all in one place at the end," proceeded Yi Chin Ho. "Your Excellency would seek far and wide and many a day for that nose and find it not."
"An unusual nose," admitted the Governor.
"There is a wart upon it," said Yi Chin Ho.
"A most unusual nose," said the Governor. "Never have I seen the like of it. But what do you with this nose, Yi Chin Ho?"
"I seek it whereby to repay the money to the Government," said Yi Chin Ho. "I seek it to be of service to your Excellency, and I seek it to save my own worthless head. Further, I seek your Excellency's seal upon this picture of the nose." And the Governor laughed and affixed the seal of state, and Yi Chin Ho departed. For a month and a day he travelled the King's Road which leads to the shore of the Eastern Sea. And there, one night, at the gate of the largest mansion of a wealthy city, he knocked loudly for admittance. "None other than the master of the house will I see," said he fiercely to the frightened servants. "I travel upon the King's business." Straightway was he led to an inner room, where the master of the house was roused from his sleep and brought blinking before him. "You are Pak Chung Chang, head man of this city," said Yi Chin Ho in tones that were all accusing. "I am upon the King's business." Pak Chung trembled. Well he knew the King's business was ever a terrible business. His knees smote together, and he near fell to the floor. "The hour is late," he quavered. "Were it not well to—" "The King's business never waits," thundered Yi Chin Ho. "Come apart with me, and swiftly. I have an affair of moment to discuss with you." "It is the King's affair," he added with even greater fierceness, so that Pak Chung Chang's silver pipe dropped from his nerveless fingers and clattered on the floor. "Know then," said Yi Chin Ho, when they had gone apart, "that the King is troubled with an affliction, a very terrible affliction. In that he failed to cure, the court physician has had nothing else than his head chopped off. From all the 8 provinces have the physicians come to wait upon the King. Wise consultation have they held, and they have decided that for a remedy for the King's affliction nothing else is required than a nose, a certain kind of nose, a very peculiar certain kind of nose. Then by none other was I summoned than His Excellency the Prime Minister himself. He put a paper into my hand. Upon this paper was the very peculiar kind of nose drawn by the physicians of the 8 provinces, with the seal of state upon it. Go, said His Excellency the Prime Minister, seek out this nose, for the King's affliction is sore. And wheresoever you find this nose upon the face of a man, strike it off forthwith and bring it all in haste to the court, for the King must be cured. Go, and come not back until your search is rewarded. And so I departed upon my quest, said Yi Chin Ho. I have sought out the remotest corners of the kingdom. I have travelled the 8 highways, searched the 8 provinces, and sailed the seas of the 8 coasts, and here I am. With a great flourish he drew a paper from his girdle, unrolled it with many snappings and cracklings, and thrust it before the face of Pak Chung Chang. Upon the paper was the picture of the nose. Pak Chung Chang stared upon it with bulging eyes. "Never have I beheld such a nose," he began. "There is a wart upon it," said Yi Chin Ho. "Never have I beheld," Pak Chung Chang began again. "Bring your father before me," Yi Chin Ho interrupted sternly. "My ancient and very much to be respected ancestor sleeps," said Pak Chung Chang. "Why dissemble?" demanded Yi Chin Ho. "You know it is your father's nose. Bring him before me that I may strike it off and be gone. Hurry, lest I make bad report of you." "Mercy!" cried Pak Chung Chang, falling on his knees. "It is impossible! It is impossible! You cannot strike off my father's nose. He cannot go down without his nose to the grave. He will become a laughter and a byword, and all my days and nights will be filled with woe. Oh, reflect! Report that you have seen no such nose in your travels. You, too, have a father." Pak Chung Chang clasped Yi Chin Ho's knees and fell to weeping on his sandals. "My heart softens strangely at your tears," said Yi Chin Ho. "I, too, know filial piety and regard, but," he hesitated, then added as though thinking aloud, "it is as much as my head is worth." "How much is your head worth?" asked Pak Chung Chang in a thin, small voice. "A not remarkable head," said Yi Chin Ho. "An absurdly unremarkable head. But such is my great foolishness, I value it at nothing less than 100,000 strings of cash." "So be it," said Pak Chung Chang, rising to his feet. "I shall need horses to carry the treasure," said Yi Chin Ho, "and men to guard it well as I journey through the mountains. There are robbers abroad in the land." "There are robbers abroad in the land," said Pak Chung Chang. "But it shall be as you wish, so long as my ancient and very much to be respected ancestors' nose abide in its appointed place." "Say nothing to any man of this occurrence," said Yi Chin Ho, "else will other and more loyal servants than I be sent to strike off your father's nose." And so Yi Chin Ho departed on his way through the mountains, blithe of heart and gay of song as he listened to the jingling bells of his treasure-laden ponies. There is little more to tell. Yi Chin Ho prospered through the years. By his efforts the jailer attained at length to the directorship of all the prisons of Cho Sen. The governor ultimately betook himself to the sacred city to be prime minister of the king, while Yi Chin Ho became the king's boon companion and sat at table with him to the end of a round, fat life. But Pak Chung Chang fell into a melancholy, and ever after he shook his head sadly, with tears in his eyes, whenever he regarded the expensive nose of his ancient and very much to be respected ancestor. End of Section 9, read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com.